and welcome. I'm Benjamin or Benjie de la Peña. I am the CEO of the Shared Use Mobility Center, and today we're helping out NABSA with this roundtable, our partner NABSA, talking about the state of the industry report of shared micromobility. And we've got a really great panel of speakers to react to it and discuss it. Just a few. One, I am assuming that you have already read the report. If not, you can turn to the chat where Destiny will be posting that link. I'd like to pull out a couple of very interesting stats from it. 83.4 million rides in North America, shared micromobility. There are 224 cities. 33% of them had scooters and bike shares, and 44% of them had e-bikes. 65% of these programs provided essential programs for essential workers during COVID-19. And that is the context that we're talking about shared micromobility here as it happened during the pandemic and how it fared. 55% of the services provided worked with their local transit agencies to bridge gaps in the transit system. And a third of them reduced or waived fees to respond to COVID-19. Interesting thing though, about half reported increases in new riders, even through the lockdown. Then in that frame too, there were some questions like, we're still underrepresented in terms of low-income households in shared micromobility. Users skew heavily to 25 and 44-year-old in that age group. And in terms of BIPOC, very underrepresented and still dominated by males. So those are just a few of the pullouts that I hope we get to discuss. But I won't be discussing all of this. I have a great panel to join me, and let me introduce them. Let me ask them to turn on their cameras and introduce them one by one. Please use the chat to chat amongst each other. The Q&A, use that to ask the panelists questions. So by order of camera turning on, Lina Fedirko is a program manager of the transportation program at the ClimateWorks Foundation. And she leads their grant making in the EV battery supply chains, urban mobility, and transport electrification in Indonesia. And she's worked on urban climate change research and as part of the Urban Climate Change Research Network and a number of local New York NGOs. Dana Yanoka is a research manager at the ITDP, or the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy. And she was focused on cycling, bike share, and other forms of shared mobility. She led the development of key publications in ITDP, like the 2018 Bike Share Planning Guide, the Electric Assist, and Taming Traffic. Her background is in sustainable urban development and international politics. Horace, can you turn on your camera? Horace, the Jew, is an analyst and the founder of SUMC, The Critical Path, and the Micromobility podcast. Fortune magazine once declared him the king of Apple analysts, but his attention has shifted from mobile phones to micromobility. And in fact, he coined that term, micromobility. His background is in business administration and electrical engineering. And finally, we have Sam Herr, who is the executive director of NABSA. And she's been NABSA's executive director since 2017. She works on the intersection of climate change and equity, and she's been working in the field of micromobility and bike share and scooter share for almost a decade. She worked for the city of Boston and the Bicycle Coalition of Maine, and her background is in anthropology and geography. So join me in welcoming our panelists. In a live version of this, we would be applauding and you would hear the applause. Maybe we'll just shake our hands this way. So I'll start with this, right? For my panelists. What does the shared micromobility state of the industry report tell us about how micromobility fared during this extended pandemic? What did we learn? I'll start with Sam, since this is a report from NABSA.
Sure. I was going to let everyone else go because it's a report from NABSA, but I'm happy to kick it off since it's a report from NABSA. So I think it's pretty clear from the report that the rapid response and resilience of the shared micromobility was pretty remarkable that there is resilience. So hopefully folks, if you haven't seen the report yet, are accessing it through the link that was shared in the chat. But one of the metrics that was reported in the report, and of course now we're almost at the end of 2021 and this report is focused on 2020 data, is that by the end of 2020, we saw that shared micromobility was within 20% of the ridership levels that it had in 2019. And that the graph in that report really shows a huge recovery once, as we all know, we all experienced, there was a lockdown period. So there was, definitely you can see that pretty clearly in the chart. And then when lockdowns began to be lifted, you see a incredible jump in ridership that just keeps going. And now that we've lived, most of 2021 now, we know that from, individual reports that have come out that systems that had been suspended and, remain suspended, although a large 75% of them had reopened by 2020, by the end of 2020. The few that hadn't yet, have reopened. There's been shared micromobility in new communities that hadn't had it before, and that we've seen record-breaking ridership in a number of cities across North America, frankly, within 2020 before lockdown, but also in 2021. So the 2021 kind of information that we've been gathering, plus the trends that are very clear in the State of the Industry report looking at 2020, I think overall that theme of resilience is just a really strong piece of the report. And of course I could go on, but we have all these other panelists, so I will pass it on. Yeah.
Well, thanks for letting me put you on the spot first, but I'll go to Dana. And Dana, dealing with both planning for these systems, what do you take away from the report? And add to that question, right? Is this a pivot point or an inflection? As Sam said, right, there's really strong recovery. That particular chart showed transit versus shared micromobility. What do you take away from it?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me today, to Sam and everyone at NABSA for inviting me to join the panel. It's really great to be here with this great group. I think just building on what Sam was saying, and something that really stood out to me from the report was this trend of first-time shared micromobility users during the pandemic. And I think that really speaks to the ability of shared micromobility to kind of fill in the gaps. I think, we're really often looking at data and sort of ridership around commute trips, but people travel obviously for lots of other reasons. And it's really important to give people options for those non-commute trips that aren't driving a private vehicle. But a lot of times those non-commute trips don't necessarily line up with, metro routes, and it can be more challenging to travel kind of neighborhood to neighborhood. And shared micromobility really plays a role in filling those kinds of trips. And I think those are the trips that people were taking during the pandemic, checking in on friends and family, taking more local trips, and not necessarily needing to go, into the CBD or downtown. And so it's really encouraging to see the use of shared micromobility for those types of trips, and supporting trips that were really essential for people to make.
I really like that the numbers are showing a lot of first-time users. And so I'm going to turn first to Horace, then I'm going to turn to Lina. And Lina, I'll turn to you with the context of COP26, right? And coming out of that. But Horace, from your industry vantage point, right, what did the last year or last 18 months represent? And particularly in this report too, right, a lot of new users, but also a slip down and a quick recovery. What are you seeing from where you sit?
Yeah, the way I characterize this, and I think that the report reflects this also, is that it's, I use this phrase from Charles Dickens: it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. We had tragedy and we had the triumph. On one hand, of course, lockdowns and an overall collapse in people moving around is a tragedy. At the same time, though, I think it opened a lot of people's eyes to alternatives. It created this new demand, this invisible demand. And as you saw in the data, yes, new people who would have never done this before suddenly tried it. We had streets that were clear and felt safer to these riders. And it's not just the United States, it's a worldwide phenomenon. Soon followed not just by shared micromobility, but owned micromobility, which is still booming. And it's only constrained by the lack of vehicles that are supply chain constraints. So it was a very interesting period that those of us who were there early on could not have anticipated. We expected sort of a traditional S curve where imitation would be driving adoption, but we saw quite a lot of people who became early adopters who we didn't anticipate as becoming early adopters. And that is also, and I think this is a credit to the institutions we have, we suddenly saw a lot more support from cities and with additional bike lanes and other infrastructures. So overall, just as one reflection upon this, we have a conference we run every year, and that we couldn't do so during the COVID period, but we just started back in September, and we had the best event ever. So the industry has definitely rebounded as far as the activities I'm observing and the community I'm observing.
Thanks. I'm going to come back to you later and ask. At the start of the pandemic, there was this question for micromobility operators, like, was money going to dry up? Were the VC going to go away? And then somewhere along the way, with a K-shaped recovery, it was like there was a lot of money sloshed around among the investor class. And so they were going to started putting money. But I'll come back to you on that. I'm going to jump over to Lina. And, in the context of COP26 closing, and there was this piece, I think it was on Bloomberg, saying, oh, they snuck in active transportation with a sentence in the agreement that said, we recognize that, that for transportation decarbonization, other forms are important. In that context, right, having gone through the pandemic and learned from this report of quick recovery and expansion, or hopefully an expansion, and then in the context of climate change, what are we learning? What's important in this report? And we need to go and tell all the climate leaders or people who are pretending to be climate leaders about it and then push it forward.
Yeah, thank you so much, Benjie. First, just want to say thanks to NABSA for planning this roundtable, and so excited to be here with everybody, close partners, ITDP and ORIS. I listen to all your podcasts and read your newsletters, so I'm really excited to be in conversation with you. A lot of things to say, but I want to start with when Sam and I had a conversation about a year ago about this report and ClimateWorks possibly coming in to support its production. The first thought that came to mind was this report is actually going to prove everything that all of us already know, which is that bikes and scooters are essential to a resilient transportation system. And I was really happy to see that the report proved just that. And we still have 2021 to even kind of nail that point down a little even further. The second piece that's really exciting, which is that for the US, I think it was an inflection point. I think cities and the public also saw that point really crystallize, like, oh, we can't just rely on our cars and transit. We actually need a ton of different modes to get us moving should something happen that's really wrong that we're not prepared for in the past, right? And then bringing us back to COP, I think that to put it into context, transportation has never been a dominating conversation at COP, and it was this year. So first of all, huge kudos to all transportation advocates on all sides for putting transportation, third of all emissions in most places, on the map. Second piece is, yes, there's still a ton of work to be done to put active transportation on par with electrification. And I want to also show huge kudos to ITDP for actually pushing on that point at COP and through a series of conversations leading up to that. I think it's unfortunate that it was just a sentence, but I do want to say that it's a huge progress that it is even a sentence. And I think the conversation about the fact that we need all strategies on deck to get us to a 1.5 degree consistent future is now becoming really crystal. And I was very happy to see the active transportation advocates and the electrification folks starting to engage in productive conversations together.
Thank you. Thank you, Lina. Great observations. I'm going to go back to you, Horace, and then I'm going to turn to everyone and ask about what's missing in this report. But I want to pursue that question of, it's in the context too of COP26, right? The big auto firms were there. Sometime this past few months, Tesla became $1 trillion company. Then it dropped, of course, right? So there's money, investments, and some of it is ESG investments going into electrification. Is that money going into shared micromobility too? And how do we incentivize that or encourage that more? And what's happening on that side of the industry, Horace? Oh, you're muted.
Thanks. That is a great question, and there's a couple of things that determine this. Of course, people who invest are just people. Let's not forget they're emotional. They're following trends. They're not strictly analytical people, and so it's important to understand the psychology of investors. I think what we've seen with initially this is called the Gartner hype curve. Usually there was a lot of money in the beginning, and it actually probably doomed the bike share systems in China, which were overcapitalized and caused a lot of chaos as a result of too many vehicles on the street. And then there was a scooter boom, and that tended to also have its moment. But the sort of, we're now reaching a plateau of productivity, as they call it. It's that moment where we're seeing the economics work. We're seeing companies go public, like even through SPACs, like Bird did, and then investors are sort of raising their eyebrows again and saying, "Well, maybe this is actually here to stay." What's also exciting, though, is that more and more of the investors are asking these questions around environmental impact. It's certainly there are dedicated funds for this, but more and more investors want to make sure that they are on the right side of that history. I don't think of anything better than micromobility as an efficiency gain and a huge win for your portfolio. And so I do think that there's going to be a renewed interest in micromobility because of its carbon impact, even though it hasn't yet penetrated the highest levels as we saw in Glasgow. And there are still people who are unaware at the highest levels that this is actually a solution for climate action. But it is beginning to bubble up, and I'm actually expecting several. There's trillions of dollars being sort of privately pledged to solve climate problems. Trillions, perhaps hundreds of trillions involved here, and I do believe a lot of that will end up in micromobility because it's such a no-brainer. So fingers crossed, but I'm sensing a shift happening here.
I'm going to come back to you, and what I want to discuss later is the Biden bill, right, and infrastructure and how we can leverage what we're learning and take advantage of that. But now let me step back and say, what was missing in the report, or what was something in the report that you wanted to see? And I'm going to turn to you, Sam, since it's your report, and say, wish we could have done more of that, or I wanted to see more of this, or I think this was missing.
Totally. And this is a great question because we're always thinking about how to expand the report, improve the report, and things like this. So one of the kind of set of things that we have our sights on is more information that has to do with riders, the users of shared micromobility. And so we've been actively trying, we are basically limited by the data that we have in this regard. And so we've been actively starting to have a conversation with the industry about a standardized user survey, or an effort to think about that and see if that might be something to essentially enable not only our shared understanding as through the report, but also, as a benefit generally to kind of gather that information and understand more. So there's a whole set of things that are related to users, and one I'll mention, for example, is there's a lot of questions that we have around purpose, and in the report, and I think this gets at a theme that I'm sure we'll touch on. We were able to gather and expanded the report in this way this year, which is we were able to gather an understanding of the integration between shared micromobility trips and transit trips. So we were able to report that around 50% of riders report that they use shared micromobility to access transit, and 16% of shared micromobility trips themselves are for connecting to transit. And that's one example, but we want to know a lot more of that kind of stuff. And so we need to develop the tools and the ability to get apples to apples data and, collect it in a way that we can then learn. So that's sort of a set of things. There's another set of things which is more related to climate. Right now we report, and it's a really strong metric regarding the CO2 offset of shared micromobility trips each year. But that is a per trip to trip comparison. So it's, just what would otherwise be an auto trip to what is now a shared micromobility trip. But of course, we all know there's externalities and a lot of other kind of factors into overall climate impact and sustainability and all these things. So we've actually been actively looking to be able to report more on that as well. And I do think the research community is starting to develop some studies that will speak to this, but we're still a little bit early in on that as well. And so anyway, those are two, and I'll maybe leave it at that so that other folks can weigh in too.
I like that, the idea of basically a calculator, right? That tells you that if you put this much more rides in shared micromobility, this is how much we're bending the carbon curve. Dana or Lina, what do you think was missing, or what would you have wanted to see more in the report?
Yeah, I'm glad Sam brought up the connection to or integration between micromobility and transit. That's something that we've been looking into at ITDP a little bit more broadly than just shared micromobility. But I was a little surprised that only 16% of trips actually connected to transit. We hear a lot about shared micromobility as sort of the first last mile solution, and really it's kind of billed as that in a lot of ways. But I actually think that it's kind of underperforming in terms of connecting to transit and really working for people who need to make multimodal trips. So it would be great to see some more data and data visualization around the growth in population around transit stations that micromobility expands, and also thinking about things like fare integration and what that means for people who are living further away and are forced to make multimodal trips, making sure that those folks aren't paying twice. So I know there have been some efforts in some cities to either reduce the cost or make free micromobility trips that connect to transit. It's a little bit challenging to do if you have multiple operators, but I'd love to see a little bit more on that, and then kind of how cities are approaching that challenge, and maybe some innovative ideas for making multimodal trips using shared micromobility more cost effective.
Thanks, Dana. Lina?
Yeah, I would actually would have loved to see the local policy measures and have the stats overlaid on top of that, because I was very curious to know how the regulatory environment changed for operators, and how that in turn impacted user accessibility or abilities just sort of to get around. And also would include, like miles of protected bike lanes in that location. And, what was kind of the average way to get around before and versus 2020. And I think, like, for me, policy is a kind of a key thing that I keep coming back to, because as a global funder, I'm always thinking, what is replicable in other cities? How can we have something that's adapted in a few places at once? And so this kind of policy instrument, either from a state level or even as far as federal, which we can talk about later, is definitely something of interest to us. Thank you.
On mute for a while. Thanks. And I was going to add something that might be interesting to see is the non-utilitarian trips, right? In the context of COVID and lockdown and our inability to gather, open spaces became important and open style recreation became important. So I wonder, of the percentage of users who are using it for the first time, how many of them used it for recreation? One of the things we learned when I was working for the Seattle Department of Transportation and we were starting to permit dockless bike shares was, or the open secret was, there was a lot more use on weekends in the parks and the trails, which was technically a violation of the permit we were giving, because we had remit over the roads, but not over the parks. And so that kind of non-utilitarian trips and what that meant, both in terms of culture, right, and the use of it, and what it means also for the kinds of facilities and networks and infrastructures we need to build that are not just about getting the downtown worker down to downtown for work. Horace, was there something missing there, or did I already go? I think I went to, but what else was missing?
I think you got it. I think the phrase we use is that there's a market for miles, which is the utility market, and then there's a market for smiles, which is the recreational market. And the idea of smiles is that people aren't just enjoying the ride, and there's a lot of joy associated with this particular mode of transport. In fact, the marketing of smiles is what the auto industry has done for a century now, looking beyond the delivery of transportation as a utility. And so we need to be aware that that's a significant job to be done. Yes, you can look at the data. For example, even the popular times a day, if you look at weekdays, you've got the commute humps, but if you look at weekends, you've got the different shape to the curve during the day due to the fact it's recreational. The other thing I'd like to point out as a desire for a future work, it would be that it's not just shared micromobility. What we've seen is that it's sort of the gateway drug to micromobility. The sharing is where people try for the first time, and then they say, this is so much fun, I want to own this particular type of vehicle, which is why actually many companies that began with sharing ended up offering also subscriptions or even directly selling the product. And so there's, economically speaking, there's definitely an interest in supplying that demand. And I think that we can't just look at it only by the particular definitions we have in terms of how it might work with our regulations or how it might work with our cities. Rather, we have to look at it from a user's point of view as like, what are they trying to accomplish? Would they be likely to use both shared and owned, depending on where they are? Would they be, again, multimodal questions, which are probably friction driven, like was pointed out already? I think Lina said this as far as the, mobility as a service in general, right? Is there something about that can be solved? So I love the report. I think it's just the right move in the in the right direction, but we need to push in all these other directions as well.
I like that market for smiles. I can imagine showing up on holiday morning with a bow tie wrapped around the bike, and my wife is not going to throw me out the house. That realistic, a new car. I don't know how many that actually happens. Maybe for the 1%, right? Well, let's talk now about the Horace opened it up, right? It's like, let's talk about equity and who uses this. shared micromobility? What do we have to work on? What is the report telling us or not telling us or prompting us to ask more questions about? And then I'm going to turn to you as kind of, from a how to plan these systems standpoint. What do you think we're learning, or what's becoming more glaring?
Well, I think the data shows that there's still a lot of underrepresentation for a lot of groups in bike share and scooter share. Some of those groups are getting closer to accurate representation, but it's still not quite there. What's really encouraging, I think, is the growth in systems that are offering e-bikes. I think it's up like 44% in 2020, up from 28% in 2019. ITDP has done some research, and others have as well, into kind of how e-bikes appeal to more people who wouldn't necessarily even consider regular bike share or riding a regular pedal bike of their own. So I think there's a lot of opportunity with the integration of e-bikes to attract more people to bike share, especially folks from those underrepresented groups. And so I think that's really kind of an exciting development that we can see growing in the report. Mm-hmm. But I think we still have a lot of ground to cover in terms of providing the type of infrastructure, safe cycle lanes that folks really need in order to consider using bike share, using their own personal bike for, utilitarian trips. We're really not there in any US city in terms of having a complete network that really serves all neighborhoods and all communities. So there's a lot, outside of just the bike share service itself that needs to happen in order for these underrepresented groups to have a chance to really use bike share.
I would love to pair the data on the use in terms of race and gender, right, and economic status with sales data that we had pointed out earlier, and it's all open news, right, that e-bikes sales are shooting out the roof, right, a 200 plus increase. But who's buying those e-bikes for the market for smiles or miles, as Horace puts it? And if that's even more skewed than shared micromobility has requirements from the cities to either geographically show up in particular neighborhoods or discounts in particular economic strata or particular communities. If the own micromobility or electric micromobility is also heavily skewed towards the privileged groups, then we're creating, again, propagating maybe green but less equitable system. I'll leave that statement and ask Lina or Sam to react to it.
I can jump in. I think, so from my point of view, I think the scooter share and bike share operators, private operators, are following a model that has been established. And that model tends to preference and target white, wealthier consumers, right? So unless we actively design a system that puts Black and brown folks first and underserved, transit underserved, then no amount of rebalancing will fix that. And we'll always be sort of catching up, trying to catch up and constantly falling short. I had a conversation with a partner that's based in Chicago last week, where they tried to include equity provisions in the policy that's going to introduce scooters to the city, and they weren't successful. Why? Why is that still a challenge? And so now their plan B is to target the permitting, equity provisions in the permits and the operations. But it's things like that that at the very forefront that are keeping the demographics pretty static.
Mm-hmm. Sam?
Yeah, that's a great segue into kind of what I want to talk about as well, or add to the conversation, which is, and this is a theme that I think comes through in the report, but it also kind of more generally is a theme that NABSA has been thinking a lot about this year, which is the real need for a holistic approach to equity, which doesn't just mean, there is a requirement to have a certain number of vehicles in underserved neighborhoods or something like this. But for example, and sort of to Dana's point, means also, and I'll just give a shout out to Better Bike Share Partnership that recently published an article on, it's called Biking Wear Black, and it's on a recent report that shows that more citations more biking citations, so to folks that are biking, are given in areas with less biking infrastructure, and areas with less biking infrastructure usually have more, BIPOC folks, people of color. And so of course, there's a big infrastructure piece to this. And I think that, we're starting to recognize that, but there's certainly more to be done. But it also, this is something that I've been personally thinking about a lot this year, and NABSA as an organization's been thinking about, and I think comes out in the report a little bit. We have a page that has, kind of reports the programmatic elements, equity elements. It also reports for the first time workforce diversity that we're looking at, and it also reports shared micromobility's response to racial justice demonstrations as well. And so to me, when I look at those three, I think what that is really saying is this is a very multi-pronged issue, and we have to think about it in a really holistic way. And to me, in my kind of own exploration, with NABSA this year, it's also comes down to some extent, sort of like personally, really addressing this so that, we are all people in these positions. So we want to start to kind of personally recognize this, thereby, hopefully changing the paradigms, thereby then, being able to kind of create this real paradigm shift that has to do with infrastructure and has to do with policy and has to do with, all these other things. So, and I think that, kind of linking back to the report, it shows progress, but it also shows room to grow. And I think that's probably why we're talking about it now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Lina or Horace, do you have your insights onto, equity and shared micromobility?
I'm a bit perplexed by the notion that the bicycle or the scooter is seen as an instrument of the elites. It is historically, the bicycle has been the tool of the underprivileged. It is in every country, in every time of history, not the automobile that is the tool for those who haven't got the means, which is why I'm attracted to the modes themselves, is because of their low-end nature. The interesting facts from Europe are that actually this was one of the few technologies whose early adopters were the elderly. This is the e-bike I'm speaking about. So that this was actually something that not the youth, which are usually the ones who really take the first stab at something new. Susan B. Anthony said that the bicycle is the greatest emancipation or emancipation tool for women that she had ever seen. It enabled women to be independent for the first time in their transport. So it breaks my heart to hear that it is not delivered equitably, that there are some who are excluded because it's not the object. It's not a matter of the intrinsic value here. It's a matter of decisions being made by people, and that needs to be corrected. It's sort of it is a sad thing, but let us keep hope that it can be made available to all, because it is certainly historically been the people's vehicle.
Yeah, I'm just to reflect on that, right? So in bicycle race, we can't separate it from discussions of power and privilege. In Bicycle Race, at Adonia Lugo's book, she talks about how the early advocates for bikes in the US were males, and it was very much sporty. And then when women and people of color started biking, suddenly they weren't interested anymore. And then we're building out infrastructure for the first streets were built really for bikes, so it'd be easier to ride a bike. Sorry for interjecting there. Lina, you may have wanted to add something.
No, I don't think I have anything else to add. I think that I agree with Horace that it was a tool for, so it was seen not as a tool for the white and privileged, but that is how it's shaken out in the US. And that is something that needs to be actively corrected. But obviously that's not what's happening in like places in the global South.
All right, we've got about 18 minutes. I will love to jump in. And Jeff Price asked the question I was going to ask, right? With the infrastructure bill, what's in there that shared micromobility can leverage, or electric micromobility, or micromobility for that matter? And what are you excited about, and what should we be pushing on? I'll open to that to anyone who wants to answer.
I can jump in first. So really excitingly, shared micromobility is now eligible officially in the CMAQ program and also the STBG program as well. And that is really important because it's been quite a gray area for some time. And so this clears that up and also offers, I think, more opportunity and also flexibility. So I would say that one of the biggest things is making sure that states and POs and even local municipalities know that there's flexibility and eligibility within these programs to be spent on shared micromobility, and to go back to a theme we've all been talking about, that shared micromobility is a piece of transportation ecosystems in regions and communities. And so let's include it as such. Also very excitingly, the most funding in the TAP program, which is the largest pot of money for safe street infrastructure. I think it's nearly a 70% increase. So that's also incredibly exciting, both for facilitating shared micromobility riding, but also when we think about equity and really creating, especially in the US, communities that can facilitate different ways of getting around. So those are definitely some exciting things, and I'll pass it on to others, and happy to jump in again in this conversation.
Horace?
I'm mostly excited about the potential to offer e-bikes to more people, and to the extent that that's allowed now through a subsidy. I haven't seen much about the shared impact on shared, but so I'm going to have to defer to others about it. I would simply say and we're not taking the point of view of only the United States, obviously, but also within the United States, there's more to policy than one bill, but it's encouraging, at least, that what we've seen.
I'm really excited for this tax credit, definitely. And I'm also wondering if this could be a leverage point to get the political will in cities to get any major mid-sized city to be 100% bikeable in the US.
That is exciting. And Dana, I'm going to turn to you with a related question, and then we're going to jump into questions from the team, right? So, are planners taking advantage of this? And, are we doing things differently? There's been a lot more ambition that was put forward, and a lot more space to move. Is that going to continue? And will the infrastructure bill help that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hopeful that this momentum is sort of an inflection point where we're going to see more support and more kind of innovation from planners and from cities. ITDP has a small US program, but the majority of our work is outside of the US, and we recently launched this campaign called Cycling Cities, where we're working with a cohort of 25 cities to improve conditions for cycling over the next couple of years. And it's really amazing to see the political will, the public support that's there in these cities for things like making their temporary cycle lanes from the pandemic permanent, making more space for cycling and walking on the street through things like car-free days. So I think that the more people that we can bring into this community, and others have mentioned this before, using shared micromobility as kind of a gateway, the more we're going to see planners and cities responding with, these type of interventions that ultimately, make our streets safer for micromobility users, but also for everyone else who's traveling. So I do think that we're starting to see that shift and really need to leverage this moment that we're in right now, coming out of some of the worst parts of the pandemic, and reevaluating, what we want to prioritize from that time, and how to, make our streets more equitable for everyone.
Great point, Lina. I was just talking to a friend who just took on a position at the federal, a federal agency. I won't name what it was, and she was talking about how in certain cities people complain about these scooters and bikes are everywhere, and the point she makes is, are they everywhere the same way cars are when you step out the door and you see cars everywhere? Because if it's like that, then I'll agree with you that they are everywhere. Otherwise, they're not, right? And so in that context, I'm going to jump to some of the questions. I think we have time for one or two. If you have a question, put it in the Q&A. It's a question if it ends in a question mark. If it doesn't, then you're making a statement. If you put your question in chat, try to put it in the Q&A. We'll probably get through one or two questions and reactions. This one is from Andrew Glass Hastings, right? And he says, the dominance of tax incentives for electric cars in federal legislation and almost no discussions for e-bikes feels like deja vu for the dominance of auto industry lobbying. In fact, I don't know if micromobility is actually mentioned in the infrastructure bill or in the discretionary funds of US DOT. What do we do to change that is his question.
Well, what do you do to change that is a really huge, really huge question. We've definitely been trying. But maybe I'll start by saying, there were, so for example, there has been some language to propose with basically for charging infrastructure, there's a tax credit for auto charging infrastructure, and to include bikes and scooters in that bill as well. So basically changing the language so that 2 or 3 wheeled vehicles are also eligible if you install charging for 2 or 3 wheeled vehicles versus just 4 wheeled vehicles, otherwise known, I guess, as cars. And so it's sort of, there's some incremental change happening, I think, is what I'm trying to demonstrate. But the point is huge, and also felt definitely that we are not gaining the grounds that otherwise we would really like to have a huge paradigm shift. And so I think a lot needs to happen, specifically gaining on the momentum that we have right now and really working together. So there's a lot of different stakeholders involved. Again, a theme we've been talking about is how do we join together? So instead of shared micromobility, just having a shared micromobility conversation, and personal micromobility or cyclists or or pedestrians having their own conversations and transit having their own conversation. And I think we've done a good job of that this year, but really need to continue that, which is all working together to sort of shift this one paradigm that we want to see differently. So and that'll come down, of course, to different policies, but I do think that that's a huge way to continue to chip away at that. But just also wanting to kind of get the message across that there have been some gains this year that kind of look like we might be slowly, but hopefully surely changing that paradigm a little bit. And sort of, I think it takes, more time and more voices and a united voice around this to continue to move that forward.
Anyone else?
Yeah,
Maybe I'll just,
oh,
go ahead. Go ahead.
I'll just say quickly, I think it would be helpful to have, or to better define like the goals that we're moving towards. I think Sam put it really well that like unifying these sometimes siloed, groups of advocates or, practitioners is really important. But like, what are we all moving towards? Like, what are the three, targets that we really want to see achieved by 2025 or 2030? Is it infrastructure miles? Is it people with access to cycling infrastructure and to bicycles? Like, what are we kind of galvanizing around? And I think that can help to kind of shape the conversation and bring together those different groups.
Horace, where are you gonna?
Just a quick note of optimism. I think that I've studied technology adoptions or diffusions in my career, and over 140 of them historically. And they tend not to be very, you can accelerate somewhat through government action, but many times, if they're a good idea, they just will continue to be popular. And so I would, I do wish there was support through our higher institutions, but I don't think it's necessary to see micromobility become successful. It's almost as if the really great disruptions, the really great low-end disruptions succeed despite the fact that most incumbents and most vested interests are against them. And so I would say, let's just keep the faith.
That's certainly very encouraging. But that brings to mind a question, and I'm going to jump away from the questions of the sometimes I feel, and maybe this is more a question to Sam and Dana, it's like, we transportation geeks are talking among ourselves while the rest of the population maybe knows about shared mobility, but not really. Is there some sort of public awareness campaign that maybe is somewhere there? And I don't know how we're going to fund that, but is there?
So I want to jump in with two points. One is, as some on this call may know, NABSA recently had our annual conference, which was held virtually this year. We had Charles Brown, who was one of our keynotes this year, and he brought up the concept of swag. Introducing more sort of swag to shared micromobility, and that based on talking with folks and feedback that we've heard, that idea had a lot of purchase. So maybe I'll just leave it there and say, let's all think about that. The second point is, I might actually kind of provide an anecdotal, just sort of anecdotal counterpoint from my own life, which is that that when I kind of move about my life, not within kind of transportation nerd groups, and I say that in the most sort of loving and affectionate way, people want to talk to me about shared micromobility all the time the second they hear that I'm involved in it. And that means something to me. And I would say even more so than when, I was just more squarely in the bicycle transportation kind of landscape. So maybe as an anecdotal point from my life, that's an encouraging sort of like maybe we are actually kind of puncturing the bubble.
I hope so. All right, I've got another question on what can we learn from Europe and Asia, and maybe I'll turn to Lina for this one, and particularly Steve Hoyt Macbeth is asking like what Paris is doing, right? What can we learn and what can we apply in North America? And Dana, I'll turn to you too, because this is kind of a planning question, right? So Paris is building out hundreds of miles of protected bike lanes, and several cities, including Stockholm, are saying, okay, central area, no more cars. Can we do that here? And what else can we learn from, cities like Barcelona?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm always thinking about what we can learn from those cities globally and bring them to the US. I think we are working against decades of culture of biking. We're also working against decades of policies that have been slowly shifting people towards more biking. And we're working against decades of underfunded transit infrastructure in the US. And all those things culminate into a lot of work to catch up to the levels of US and Asia. And it's a little bit disheartening, actually. It's easier, like from a perspective of a global funder, it's easier to get traction on shared micromobility in places like Europe, where there's already an underlying culture and all you need is a bold mayor to kind of like push the city through the finish line, or in places in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, where there's not such entrenched personal vehicle ownership. So there's this opportunity to leapfrog, right? As people are starting to think about owning their vehicles, we're actually doubling down with partners like ITDP in expanding transit and making sure that it connects to bike share that's now being introduced to the city. And then coming back to the US, I keep coming back to an unpopular maybe idea, which is that we have to make driving very expensive and very inconvenient if we really want to speed up the curve. Like I agree, popular stuff is going, but these bikes are gonna keep being used and shared micromobility is gonna hopefully keep growing. But we actually need to bring in the sticks if we want to level the playing field. Also, let's look at our streets, like we really need to create safe space for people to bike around, which is why women are not the dominant group that uses any of these modes. And so I wish there was like more specific things, but I think it's just harder here. And I think the political will, I think the free parking, 8 free spots for every vehicle. It's just, it's all working against us here. Turning to Dana, maybe she has some good solutions.
No, Lina, I think you made the point really well. And I'll just make a few supporting points, which is that, the role of shared micromobility is a bit different in places like Southeast Asia and Latin America, where in many cases the dominant mode is walking, not because it's really lovely to walk, but because that's really the only affordable option people have. And private vehicle ownership is quite a small percentage of the population. And in addition to that, like overcrowding on transit versus in the US, where we're really trying to get more people to use transit. So the context is just a bit different, and the role for shared micromobility and who it's really for is a bit different, and it can be hard to kind of compare those scenarios. But I think things outside of shared micromobility, like parking policy, like thinking about low emission zones and congestion pricing, is really what we need to think about for cities in the US to really shift demand away from private vehicles and open up space for shared micromobility.
One of our panelists in our summit earlier this year made a point about how in our heads, spatially, car infrastructure is huge, right? You step out of your house, the road's there, and you see cars, like I said earlier. And you see highways, and they're huge. And infrastructure for shared micromobility, maybe you see it on one particular road, and maybe it's protected. And so I think just the visual and cognitive spatial effect of knowing that that's available could make a difference, right? But I'm with Lina. Go ahead, Horace.
Yeah, there's a saying in micromobility that your customer acquisition costs are zero because you don't have to advertise. Your advertising are the vehicles on the street. that's a powerful thought, and I think it reflects this idea that what you see is what exists. Yeah. I'll just interject a little note of optimism about the U.S. versus the rest of the world. I've lived abroad as well, and certainly you can see the better infrastructures and the wider acceptance and higher modal shares. But let's not forget that as far as the scooter is concerned, it's an American invention in the sense that the first company to do shared scooters was actually Bird. And of all places, they did it in Los Angeles or Santa Monica precisely, not in New York, not in Boston. It's a sort of a paradox that a lot of the interesting ideas for micromobility have been sort of conceived in the United States, and very quickly they spread globally. In fact, in Europe, scooters were illegal in Germany for at least a year and a half after they were perfectly commonplace in the United States. And there's still very few of them in the UK, and God knows the UK, London could use them. But there's this not to say nothing else is going on elsewhere, but the US borrows some ideas, the US gives some ideas, and I think there's a lot of cross-pollination going on at the technology level. And yet we still have a few very interesting new things to solve as far as safety and other things. For example, smart helmets, better lighting, traction control, ABS. These are technologies which are not requiring breakthroughs. They just need to be adapted to this new modes and made cheap enough. And that will help a lot in adoption. It'll help because of feelings of safety and awareness. And who knows, it might become super cool for everybody to do just because it's something you see someone else doing that seems cool. So I'm very optimistic that a lot of these problems we have can be overcome, and some of that is also going to be capital coming in. And so, yeah.
Well, I'll take that as kind of a prelude to or first step towards wrapping up. Right, I'm told we still have a few more minutes, but let's wrap up now and ask each of the panelists. Right, so what's your closing statement? What are you optimistic about? What are you worried about? And how do we get to this market of smiles that Horace is talking about, and the presence of infrastructure? And then we'll wrap it up. I'll start with Lina.
Wow, way to put me on the spot, Benjie. Okay. Okay, so a couple of things. One, what's really exciting is, as I mentioned in my first remarks, I do think this is an inflection point. I do think we're turning the corner globally, and there's sort of a lot of excitement that comes along with that. What we're prioritizing are things like transit and micromobility connectivity, so integration. I think we have the modes that we need. It's now we should double down on making sure that they work better together and figuring out how to design public space in a way that supports the most efficient modes. So essentially not cars or not single occupancy vehicle trips. And then the piece that I'm always worried about is that I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that we're all trying to get to the same thing. And our biggest opposition is and was, and it is going to continue to be, is the oil industry. And the more that we fraction into divergent views, the more traction they get in slowing down e-bikes, electric vehicles, reallocation of public space, move away from cars, any of those things. And so I think the more we can have conversations that integrate modes and that talk about some of our general priorities across our different advocacy groups, I think the likelier we are to succeed across the board.
Thank you, Lina. Dana?
Yeah, I mean, definitely support what Lina just said. And I think, the whole purpose initially for bike share is really providing access to bicycles for people when they need them without having to purchase their own bicycle, maintain their own bicycle. And now we're seeing that expand to different forms of vehicles like e-bikes and cargo bikes. And there's just still so much potential there. We didn't get a chance to really talk about it here, but there's a lot of development in sort of the local goods delivery space, thinking about e-bikes and e-cargo bikes. And I know some bike share systems have actually piloted e-cargo bikes in their systems. So there's a lot of space to kind of expand. And I think that we're all working towards the same goals of reducing private vehicle trips and demand for private vehicles where that makes sense, and really shifting to these smaller, lighter modes. And it's going to take a village.
Thanks, Dana. Sam?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Lina and Dana have said before me, but maybe just to kind of reiterate and give my support to those comments. I certainly think that we are in an inflection point period of time, which is reflected in the recent federal policy, the IIJA that we were talking about before. And I think just generally what we've been experiencing precipitated by COVID and that experience. So I would definitely say I feel optimistic given kind of where policymakers are at, as well as the opportunity for unification, and also really second that call for kind of unifying around particular messages. I think really has been a theme of this conversation. I also really like, Dana, what you just said about the optimism or just the kind of importance of the introduction of shared e-cargo bikes now and other kinds of forms and what that, and also delivery service integrations into kind of shared e-bike fleets and things like this, and really all of shared micromobility and kind of like what evolution that's going to take, I think is really I have a lot of optimism there. And then really, Horace, what you've shared in this discussion, it gives me great optimism as well about kind of your vantage point of investment in shared micromobility development, and this point in particular that you made around regardless of whether the policy kind of like the funding structure is there's funding in other ways that we can sort of like accomplish this, and I think that everything is needed. So I think we're going to need a lot of I work on federal policy a lot, and we really need that to move forward. But the piece about kind of that you have witnessed that there is other funding there, I think that we're going to need all of it to sort of continue to push that that message forward.
Horace, a few more words before I wrap up.
Yeah, just I of course, I think you guys have stolen all the thunder and doing a great job at advocating for this idea. But I do want to wrap with one simple thing, which is that I want to explain the graph behind me. I don't know if it's been bothering you all this time as I've been speaking here, but it's actually something that's close to my heart, which is that we need a simple way to explain the value of micromobility. The fact of the matter is that most trips are short. The fact of the matter is that the small vehicles consume an order of magnitude less in energy, but also they emit a magnitude less in terms of emissions. As this is becoming now the hottest topic in the world, and I mean that both, without exaggeration, we need to actually explain that micromobility is not just good, it's not just fun, but it actually can save us all and make money in the process, which is sort of like almost like a miracle to think that this is possible. So all I'm illustrating behind me here is that you can see the distribution of trips by modes, and you have at the top, you have automobility, which is highly destructive and covering a certain amount, a certain amount of miles, which is this area you see above in sort of orange, and then you have transit, which is blue, covering more distances horizontally. That's distance. But in costing less in terms of emissions. And finally, you have micromobility, which is really thin at the bottom in green. And it doesn't cover the same distances as the other two, but it goes quite far, and yet it consumes so little. So it's all about taking a few of the worst miles and converting them. And that will make more of an impact than a lot of the trillions of dollars being spent out there. And transportation is now 25 to 30%, depending where you're measuring, but globally it's 25% of all emissions. And most of that is because of the automobile. And I think this is a put it another way, I think if micromobility were a pill, it would be considered a miracle pill. We've got to get that message across.
And on that note, please join me in thanking my panelists. Thank you to NABSA for hosting this event and for such a great report. For SUMC for helping out, to Israel, my colleague, and Destiny for putting all of these together, and to you, all of you, for joining us for more than an hour for this really, really interesting roundtable. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day.